Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We move to the next panel. Digitization of supply chain finance. I have great pleasure in introducing Mr. Sambasivan. He is the Proposition Sales Manager, Trading and Enterprise Solution, South Asia Refinitiv. Sambasivan is the Proposition Sales Manager at Refinitiv London Stock Exchange Group Company. He leads the team of specialists in South Asia who work with banks and corporate treasury, helping them with trading solutions and data feeds. He has over 14 years of experience in the financial services industry with expertise in foreign exchange trading, EFX, fixed income markets, and data feed solutions. In his previous role, he was leading a solution consultant team in South Asia, solving complex issues of customers across financial markets in areas of FX trading, fixed income valuations, LIBOR transition, and quantitative analytics. Mr. Sambasivan holds a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering and a postgraduate in management from the TFI Management Institute, Manipur. Over to you, Sambasivan of Refinitiv.
Thank you, Mr. Venkatraman. Thanks a lot. That was a very, very interesting discussion earlier from Dr. Acharya. It's a very intriguing topic. I think before I get into the details, maybe I'll start by introducing the panel members. First, we have with us Mr. Srinivas Padmanabhan, also known as Mr. Venkat. He's a serial investor, entrepreneur, and also currently working as President of Finance at Olam International Limited. He is a senior member of Finance Executive Committee, Finance Talent Management Committee, and member of Operational Committee at Olam Group. Mr. Venkat has more than 30 years of extensive experience in leadership areas, oversight on multiple regions, as well as business verticals. He's helped build businesses from scratch, implementing systems and processes to support it. Welcome, Mr. Venkat. Secondly, we have with us Mr. Ravindra Krishnappa. Ravi is the co-founder of Seabridge TFX, a supply chain financing platform based in Singapore, where he looks after their technology strategy. He's also the managing partner at July Ventures, an early stage venture fund. He's in the past been a very active angel investor with over 15 startups in his portfolio. He's been an entrepreneur for over 20 years now, with his first venture becoming part of Oracle. He led the Oracle's offshore consulting division as its executive director. He was the co-founder of Inatech, a supply chain technology company, until 2010. Since then, he's helped start multiple startups, ScienceCenter, AceBot, QFast, and Seabridge TFX. It's a pleasure to have you on board. Welcome, Mr. Ravi.
Likewise, good to be here.
Right. Lastly, we have Mr. Raj Melvani. Raj is the Regional Proposition Sales Director, managing commodities and corporate treasury across Asia at Refinitiv, an LSEG business. He's currently based in Singapore. He works very closely with very large corporates and trading firms to help them with data, analytics, and workflow solutions across foreign exchange, money markets, as well as commodities. He's a specialist in commodities, so we really look forward to his views on commodities as well. Welcome, Mr. Raj.
Thanks a lot, Sankara. Welcome, everyone. Thank you.
All right. So, there's been a lot of emphasis on digitization in the earlier discussions as well. So it's a great segue into this panel, and we'll be covering very specifically on the topic of digitization of supply chain finance. We would like to look at how is it evolving across Asia and probably where does India fit in the entire framework of things. So let me start with the first question to you, Mr. Venkat. Past 2 years has been quite challenging due to COVID, especially with a lot of supply chain disruptions. In your personal view, what do you think are the key challenges faced today by corporates as well as SMEs in supply chain financing?
Good evening, friends, whichever part of the world. Good evening, good morning. Great to be part of this session. Yeah, like you said, the last 2 years, predominantly what is very obvious is concentration risk. People are focused on value over diversification. and then focused on a geography or a particular segment, and they got stuck because of things cannot move. That's true for commodities. That's true for supply chain finance as well. But the blessing in disguise in the last 2 years, because of being COVID, what would have taken a decade or even more for a digitization to take place, and that becomes part of it, which got it done because the digitization and the technology, the power of technology to solve the issues, some of the new bees in this market, how they able to disrupt the market and facilitate and raising to the occasion was very, very astonishing and happy to note, right? So there are banks getting displaced, and then there are, mini and NBFC kind of people and techno entrepreneurs coming to the place and filling up the vacuum of the space, which got constrained because of this COVID, coming out with a very, very agile, cost-effective solutions, which is less of physical contact, which was very wonderful. So that's what I'll say. It is a problem, but immediately the human might be able to find some quick solutions.
Perfect. Thank you. Ravi, again, similar question to you. What, in your opinion, are the key challenges faced by corporates and MSMEs? I'm quite certain, obviously, large corporates have different challenges vis-a-vis MSMEs. So how do you look at that?
So I actually want to see this in two dimensions, right? And let's look at the area that Venkat is more focused on or has had the experience, that is on the commodity side, right? And then look at the supply chain, which is what I call as the distributor, retail, individual components, right? And we know what COVID has done to both of those. On the commodity side, for the very first time, you had commodity rates almost shoot up twice, thrice in some cases. Some commodities rose up, right? And this is not related to money supply at all. If you think about it, most governments injected so much cash into the system. It was not so much as a demand supply in terms of money supply to availability that was a problem. It was just the ability to go ahead, plan, and be able to source that became an issue, right? So in that sense, the digitization has completely changed in the last 2 years, right, on the commodity. You will see that also translate when it comes to the corporate supply chain, right? When I say corporate supply chain, it could be downstream, that is retail, or it could be upstream from the parts side, right? So what has happened is upstream supply chain has been stressed, again, not because of want of money. It is just because of the constraints associated with the supply chain constraints, not just the Suez issue, not just the blocking of a few other things, and now the chips shortage in the industry. It's the overall tightening of that process where there were so many long structures in that supply chain. You had so many intermediary parties, right? So I think there are two things that are emerging. One, I believe it's not going to be so much about money. It's going to be about time in the future. So how can I collapse on time, and how can I take away all those intermediary layers so that I have a direct visibility to both demand and supply across the Teflon tube?
All right, thank you, Ravi. On a lighter note, I think even though the Suez Canal issue impacted so many different players, I think the Twitter had a feast of memes which kind of went through. On the different types of supply chain financing, what are the type of financing methods which are emerging? So is it more buy-led? So how do you differentiate between commodities? So what are the types of financing which is emerging? Mr. Ravi, again to you.
Oh, for me, all right. Well, obviously the traditional factoring is moving away, right? So you have more and more buyer-led, because I have visibility to the actual transaction. I think one of the things that, I didn't want to bring it up as early in the discussion, but if you had things like green seal, that creates a problem in the ecosystem, right? That there's a lack of trust if you may, of the actual transaction that is sitting out there. So two big areas of change. One is that the credit is getting more and more granular in terms of the risk ability. So it's no longer who the counterparty is. It's more than party validation. It's, I think, starting to move towards transaction validation, right? How do I actually assess a particular transaction and assess the risk on that particular transaction, be able to go back and say, do I want to get involved in that process or not, right? So the assessments have got smaller and smaller and shorter in times in my reactionary process. That is one. Second, I do believe this buyer-led financing is going to start to take off, simply because these are authenticated transactions sitting in an ERP. Now, there are quite a few people who are saying, I will give you the source of the transactions and enable blockchain all the way through. But in my mind, blockchain has a starting point, right? And you have to make sure that the intent is clean, right? I can have the best of technology, but if my intent is not clean, then technology can only perpetuate it further because you don't have the clarity on intent. How do you get clarity of intent? Is in a supply chain, the intent is on the demand side. That means the buyer has generated the downstream activities or the backend activities that have to be backflushed, right? So in all of our supply chain planning, we have this backflush where we look at the demand and we do a forecast and we go backwards, right? I think a lot of that supply chain financing is also going to follow that model, because then I have visibility to what is being out there in the future, right? I think that's a big difference that I think is going to change.
Understood. Maybe on that note, let me come back to you, Mr. Venkat.
Yeah.
What do you think large corporates should be doing today to support some of these SMEs through that process? I mean, is there something which they already do? To help them with financing, or is there something which they do to support them through that process? How does it work today?
Yeah, good. So just to add on to what Ravi was mentioning, see, I'll be using the word concentration. That's a very broad term. Concentration of financing, concentration of buying, right? Both per se. So in the past, if you look at it, big banks, I mean, I'm talking about pre-COVID, though the trends were changing, globally, crowdsourcing was kickstarting, but predominantly still it was bank-led funding and those kind of things, that's what is happening. Similarly, sourcing also is on a bulk basis. The whole distributor channel, there are multi-channel, wholesale to distributor retail, and then reverse buying also from LBA, local buying agent, all the way through middleman to the top. But during the COVID, it's all got disturbed because people are not able to rotate the stock. That led to credit problem, and because of credit problem, bankruptcies, and they're not able to service the loan, and then banks have tightened. And the number of companies which has gone bankrupt, big and small, during the last 2 years, it's created a huge change. But at the same time, things have to move on. Life is to move on. 7-8 billion people have to be fed, and things have to go on. That is where I think everybody started reinventing the wheel. So when I say reinventing, fortunately in our group, we have been always close to farm gate from the beginning. By design, we touch 5 million farmers, we buy as close to farm gate, and then supply to factory gate. That's our mantra. That's what we built. But many other companies also started moving to that pathway to say that how can we close to the sourcing and to distribution, both sides. And that led to, with the technology benefit, avoiding the middleman. That means the people you can only flourish and grow once you pay the right reward to the farmer, the both ends of the chain, right? Whether SMEs or the farmer, the weaker section, how do they get the fair share of the profit? With this technology enabling, that is made possible. And you also know now more and more people are realizing that the perception of credit is changing. It's not a big amount. The people who are at the lowest strata is the least defaulters. I mean, you would have seen, in any NBFC scheme, you will see the number of defaulters are very low because even though they pay higher interest for the banks and everybody, they pay. It is in the, like you said, the intention Ravi was mentioning about. That is where things have gone wrong, or by design or by accident, both way. May not be by design, but by accident. So what the transformation which I'm able to see from the top management, top of all the corporate companies, if you look at it, how do they source directly? people are going in and financing, microfinancing at the farmer level or at the distributor level or the retail level. Be it, Reliance example, you take it in India, or you take it, many of the agri companies now going into farm fresh, directly buying from the farmers. Because this change in mentality which has come today, because one, that gives them visibility, traceability of the material. And then now they're realizing there's also giving an added latent benefit, which is called the traceability. Because of traceability, whether with blockchain or otherwise, you're able to say that from where I'm buying, there is no child labor, there is no carbon footprints, there are no chemicals are used, you're able to get a premiumized. So then it is further motivating people that, hey, this I've done because of necessity, but that become a model today, and I can monetize that value. That lead to green financing. Now the banks are ready to finance. Okay, you issue green bond, and then you do. These are the parameters on sustainability, which the carbon emissions are biggest problem of the world. How you are able to, get the best farming practices into place, and that when into the farmers are being taught the latest technology, like yield differences. If you look at between Australia and India, huge. But the technology transfer and the techniques are getting transferred through the big MNCs. The overall change. So it's very, very welcoming. I mean, in that sense, it's very promising as well.
Yeah, I think very, very important point, right? The credit structure has moved down to the transaction, right? So exactly what he's talked about. So if you kind of fast forward and go through, I believe the MSMEs are the ones who are going to benefit. Just like I believe in the green financing, the real delivery on the ground would probably be the FPOs sitting out there who have always been struggling for finance, right? If you think about it. They do have the advantage of what I call as the community risk structure, right? Which means that you can actually build a community around that. The small trader, the community risk structure can be associated. Now they were not visible at all in the supply chain. With the technology, that is getting visible, and you're able to push that down all the way through very, very quickly.
Yeah, the classic example, just to add on that, is Geo Kirana shop. I'm taking India example, though I can take 70 countries example world over. But if you look at it, simple. That small shop, which is a mom and pop shop today, getting digitized, getting ordering basis on a WhatsApp. In Mumbai, they have a model stores. I mean, that's a small example, but that's happening all over the world in a different form and manner.
No, I mean, that's very, very insightful, right? I mean, for any layman, I mean, like, if I look at it, I mean, if I am able to have the history of that particular mom and pop shop, of that particular Kirana shop, and a very nice history in terms of how the cash flows have been, anyone would be willing to finance them as they have more.
Yeah, and exactly the point, the cash flow prospects, which means that, I have 50 invoices. I don't want to discount all of them at one shot, and I don't want to discount them ahead of time, right? If my cash flow needs me to discount, 20,000 in 3 days' time, I should be able to claim it in 3 days' time, not 2 weeks earlier in the worry that I'm not going to get the money in hand in time, right? So that self-service structure of being able to manage. So all the systems that we are putting together is focused on this concept that you get the money when you want it, at the time you want it, at your request or at your time frame kind of a structure.
And not only for money, it's also supply and demand. For example, today, if you look at it today, nobody needs to store anything.
Right.
It is humanly impossible. People are able to supply in 4 hours in India. Again, Indian case study, I'm taking about Asian Paints example. Indian case study, if you look at it, they don't store anything. Every retailer has been assured in a day, 4 times the replenishing stock. Asian Paints in India, right? That means stocks need not be stored. That means money is getting released. Your credit period can be extended because it's an assured supplier and buyer. That means you are getting financing at a much, much, much longer period. I mean, things are changing dramatically. Sorry, I can go on speaking on this topic.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Venkat. Thank you. My next question is to Raj. Raj, there are obviously different players in this supply chain finance, right? So you obviously have the large corporates, you have the MSMEs, and then obviously the most important person is obviously the bank or the financial institution who needs to fund these, right? So how is let's say a buy-led model or something on those lines would help and digitization of that, right? supporting all of these players, right? So what is everyone gaining out of this entire process?
Yeah, so I think our esteemed colleagues already covered quite a lot of what's in it for buyers and the sellers. But I think the interesting thing that we're seeing, at least across Asia, is the willingness for buyers to look at alternative sources of funding. Now, actually, it links in very nicely to what we were talking about earlier about having a better credit profile for the smaller guys, the smaller suppliers. But someone still needs to go in and be able to fund further down the supply chain. And traditionally, I mean, for various different reasons, we know that banks are not as willing nowadays and going into the future to fund further down the supply chain, right? So that's where we see, I would say, the biggest change is that alternative funding, non-bank funding, maybe another way to think about it, is now a real possibility, fully made available through the digital transformation of the whole supply chain processing framework. And actually, it's been touched on even in the previous discussion here at the conference around credit, the ability to digitize a credit profile, even for the smallest guy, and then allowing for better credit terms, and also from a funding perspective for the non-bank funders, no matter wherever they're sitting, whether they're sitting in India or overseas, to feel comfortable financing that transaction. So all of a sudden, the pool of financing is potentially a lot bigger than what it was, 5-10 years ago. So, I mean, I think that's a key driver that's going to revolutionize, I would say, the whole buyer-led model. Now, obviously, for the banks, maybe not the best news, but what we're also seeing, interestingly, is the banks, I think, know this. And they know that they no longer have a captive audience for supply chain financing. And what we're seeing is that they're also talking to the digital players to try and link in either from a funding perspective or either from a digital perspective in order to capture some of that transition in the marketplace. So I think it's extremely exciting times for everyone, for the buyer, for the suppliers. But as I said, I think the most interesting angle to all of this is the universe of funders and what that's going to do to the supply chain. That is going to be key. That's how I think about the whole buyer-led model between where it was 5 years ago, where it is now, which is an inflection point, and where we see it being in 5 years' time.
Thank you, Raj. Thank you. So my next question is obviously on the topic of technology. So let me ask Ravi about it. So Ravi, how is digitization helping this entire process? We've touched upon obviously visibility of a lot of data available as part of the process, but how is it in general supporting it right now? From a perspective of end-to-end workflow of a supply chain finance?
Yeah, so across the board, when I say across the board, how is it digitization is completely changing the complexity across the board. A couple of things, right? So if you think about, let's talk about the onboarding process, right? So typically an onboarding process used to take a whole lot of time because you had to get all the artifacts, the collection, 3 years worth of balance sheet. I now have to go back and check the registry. I have to go back and figure out whether you have to work through. So if you take that process, just like what happened with telecom, where you could go in and walk out with a chip, with a SIM card in an hour's time once you got that connectivity. I am very, very hopeful that we are going to have that kind of a KYC and an onboarding structure set up at some stage, right? Now, it may seem very dramatic, but then if you think about the infrastructure that is getting built in India, I think we are in for for a great ride. I don't know how much whether somebody covered the account aggregator model in the structure today, but if you think about it, to me the whole fintech, which used to be vertical, is getting layered and horizontal in a structure. So you have the KYC structure, then you have the microservices, which means that I will do an AML check, I will do a credit check, and I'll do a green check, right? I'll go back and say, what's the carbon credit? And I can see Raj smiling because that's essentially where Refinitiv is going, right? So you have these microservices where I can on demand get the scores that I want. I may not have a comparative in that place as of now because I may not have built the data associated with it, but at least I get to know what the current standing is, right? And as I go up, you will see that today you don't need to build all of this in a monolithic fashion, right? Let's say I'm a neobank, I'm somebody coming into this. Earlier, what all? You had to build these whole layers. You had to do KYC, you had to do AML checks, you had to do onboarding process. On top of that, you had to build it and integrate to your banking system, right? Which means that you had to have a loan ledger, you had to have some way of defining what your program structures is, you had to have a distribution network. And on top of that, you couldn't do a syndication of funds into a syndicated pool, right? If you think about it, there is now a player who will come in and do all of this in that particular structure, right? So just like you can go in today on and buy a mutual fund just by a few clicks of button, I'm hazarding the guess that you are going to see those kind of funding opportunities getting listed out. So it's going to be no different than the other asset class. Today, if you go back to what it was, the whole supply chain finance was seen as a very, very specialized funding set of class, which means I had to have a large operations team. I had to have a large set of people who were the specialists in that particular structure. And the deal origination was something that I had to go back and nurture over a period of time, right? So in that sense, that whole structure is, the stack is getting rebuilt, right? And great times from an India perspective, not just because of account aggregator model. You now have any of these people can go in and do a fund distribution. You will have notes getting listed. I know some startups are already talking to RBI to see if they can get notes listed on bonds, corporate bonds getting traded. So there's nothing stopping us from floating Olam bond for their suppliers, right? That's how fast the stack is getting built. And the stack is not getting built by one company, one individual. The stack is getting built by layers, which means that you can come in and plug this across. So the example that Venkat was using, there is a trader sitting out in Singapore can plug into this particular stuff, including an FX, where they will read the FX rates of Refinitiv's FX module.
Yeah. Just to add on, if I may, Sankara, on both the points, Raj and here. So first thing is, in my belief, and it's already changing, and it's not visible, but you will see, there is no more competition. It's a collaborative model. That means banks also not at risk. Banks are welcoming. Barring few, everybody changing it. Look at today, DBS Bank, it's no more a DBS. It's a fintech company. I mean, people know what all they've done today. Piyush had the vision and then he moved fast. That's what needed today. So it's a collaborative model and then it is also bridging many gap. And then let's not take away the credit of the government and infrastructure, what they're doing. Let's look at some India example. And I'll give one example so that whatever we discussed so far, there'll be take-home value for the audience to take back through a story, this story which I'm sharing. Now, you look at it today, the infra-wise, we got this Aadhaar. That means, the KYC talking about is become much, much simpler in India per se, and we can talk about worldwide. Second, we talk about data connectivity. It's become as cheap. A coconut plucker also has got a smartphone in his back. That's the power of the data and things have changed. That's very important. Without that, none of this can be done, right? Third, if you look at it today in terms of the infrastructure ability, earlier in India, 30 kilometer per speed is what the freight corridor. There is no dedicated corridor. Today, we have a 90 kilometer freight corridor. That changes the supply chain economics. GST coming in, there are no barriers. The trucks are waiting for 3-4 days in each moving post. So we can have a centralized port and then things can get distributed. Swiggy kind of models that come in where people are, you don't need to do everything your own. There are outsourcers who are ready to deliver at throwaway price. Here I'm taking food example for Swiggy, but like that, there are many people have come in. So with this ecosystem coming in, it's all helping each other. Let's take the Kirana stop, which I talked about in Mumbai, in some Andheri or some remote location, one small shop guy. Earlier, he used to buy and keep all this from a wholesaler. Today, with the technology and this kind of biggies are coming and helping, we have a full visibility and demand of what is happening in the corridor, right? Who is buying what frequency. Data is power. The more data we gather, we know what kind of demand supply coming. If that demand supply coming back to the supplier, the guy who is doing it, including the middleman and wholesaler, the channel of information, when it go, all the inefficiencies are getting leaked out. We don't need to stoke it everywhere. When they get leaked out, the aggregation model which is coming in, because though that at the segregate level, the small mom and pop shop and the nearby housing colony who are buying on a credit, 30-day, 20-day credit, now I can be aggregated because it's all technology, and that can be aggregated and given to palm it off to somebody else. Now the palming off to somebody need not be a bank, because everybody, you and me, individual, everybody is sitting on huge cash piles. A bank is giving zero interest rate. Be it a BLAC or etc. With the crowdsourcing, then people can come and put into that, and there's a security. Insurance can come and add on to that, saying that, okay, it's a risk-reward ratio, 10% risk you take, 90% I'm going to take it. Now you see that the whole ecosystem is dramatically changing. Paper use. In the past, people have invested millions and millions of dollars for creating an ERP. Today, you call an SME or one of the university IIT graduate and tell him that you develop an app. So long as you have clarity, we don't need a CTO. He will develop much bigger product for you. And ERPs are becoming now thousands of small apps getting together. That become an ERP. Things are changing. That means you can use it in an app or as an ERP. It's all interconnected. With the API technology, anything and everything can be interconnected. People are opening it up. More and more open source is happening. No more protectionism. Though the world is talking about protectionism, in the technology space, I can see more and more open source codes are coming up. More and more because of the connectivity and remoteness, people are able to, from anywhere, can come in and able to come and supply to anybody in the formal manner, right? For example, some of the startups where I invest, earlier we used to have 30, 40, 50 people sitting in the same office. Today, somebody in Poland, somebody in Ukraine, somebody in Odisha is developing my products. And that too pay as per usage. I can bid for any services, and there are available schemes available, platforms are getting generated, right? So what I'm trying to say is it's a fascinating world in every sense. I'm not only talking about commodity, whether it's the money, whether it's the technology, whether it's the people. Your talent, yes. And a YouTuber is earning millions of dollars sitting in some village today. You can learn in a village, a cricketer. I can identify the talent through an artificial intelligence, through the camera, small iPhone camera. I can take a photo and he can say he's going to be my future fast bowler. Wow, what world we are. This is fascinating. So supply chain per se, like earlier Ravi was mentioning, because of all this infrastructure was not available, that was becoming untouchable for many. Because we need a specialized people and then a lot of government compliances, AML and this and that, and everywhere be suspicious. We put a black glass and see everybody, oh, he's wrong, unless he proved not otherwise. But things are changing today. You and me, public data is available everywhere. Social footprints are available anywhere. Yeah. So in that sense, privacy going away, but in that sense, it's also benefiting a lot more because we are able to identify. And again, Ravi was mentioning, it is not the credit of the person. The transaction, so long as proof it is getting done, A started, B started, C it is ended. I don't need a 3-year history now anymore. I need that moment, that activity, that is visible. The bill of lading can I trust? The stock is there in the container. And who is validating? That's where the blockchain, whether you want to use the technology or whatever, it's a revalidation of 2-3 nodes. That whether you use blockchain or a simple app.
A simple ERP integration.
Simple Excel file. Forget about everything. Simple Excel. The point what I'm trying to say is because of these dotted connections. That is why somebody says blockchain will take 10 years. I said, no, forget about blockchain. Blockchain as a concept, which is a trust in efficiency, right? And crypto, again, I don't want to talk about today because many of them are untouchable, but we can't stop it. Someday they're going to create. All the arts, today people are converting that arts, where the crypto's influence is unbelievable. It's a very, very interesting space, dear friends. Who's over listening, it's a fascinating space for all of us.
Yeah. I mean, it's we can just keep hearing your talk, but there's only limited time, so I'm probably going to have to now move to Raj. So before I go to Raj, maybe Alma's team, if you can put up the slide, that'll be helpful. Raj, I mean, this question is to you, right? So now, how do you, Mr. Venkat and Mr. Ravi, both of them have talked about, how we can bring all of these players together. But how do we create a marketplace where all of these people can come together, and how is it that we can do that more efficiently?
Yeah, thanks for that, Sankara. So I think that, I mean, obviously, as we're talking about the intersection between all the financing models and, the digital world, we obviously see that from our perspective, Refinitiv, a big opportunity, right? And, traditionally, for those of you, I'm sure there's many on the call here who are using our services in the past, we're not trade finance experts. So what we have done is that we have partnered with Ravi and the team with Seabridge TFX, and we're using basically their digital and industry knowledge around trade finance. And it goes exactly back to looking at every piece of the transaction, right from paper through to shipment, through to tracking the vessel, through to KYC, through to AML. So, I mean, from a Refinitiv perspective, we have all the different elements, but we're using the big brains of Ravi and Seabridge TFX to bring that all onto one platform, right? So when we say all on one platform, I mean, we really are talking about all on one platform. So we are bringing in the buyer community, we're bringing in the supplier community. We talked a lot about the funding community as well. So we're bringing them all onto one platform, fully digitized. And what we are seeing also, as I said a bit earlier, is that we are seeing also banks and other trade finance digital providers also wanting to interconnect. So we talk about microservices, but this is essentially like a macro service, right? Big existing players wanting to leverage off a network effect, right? Now, again, from our perspective, why we think we're going to be a little bit unique in this game is simply because, for example, we are present in 12,000 large corporates today, right? We're already serving their treasury departments one way or another. From a funding perspective, we already service many investment managers, whether they be family offices or alternative investment managers. They're also connected to our platform, right? So when we talk about getting traction or get a big network effect between connecting, funders and people who want funding in the supply chain, we already have that. What we were really missing was the trade finance expertise and digitizing the whole platform, no matter whether you're a funder, supplier, or a buyer in this model. So again, I think that's what we have done with the help of Seabridge TFX. We have taken a minority stake within Seabridge TFX as well. So this is not a short-term play. I mean, this is a very long-term play, and we're building almost on a daily basis the elements of that supply chain transaction that we talk so much about in this session, to digitize every single piece as much as we can. It may not be perfect, but it's certainly not perfect today. And as we layer on through different digital services, more and more information about that transaction, that gives confidence across all of the participants, especially the funders, especially the non-traditional funders, to be able to participate. And obviously that's going to be great for the whole community. So I hope that kind of explains a little bit about what we're trying to do in this space.
Thank you, Raj. Thank you. That's quite helpful. I think we'll move on to final remarks. Maybe I think it's been a lot of interesting discussion. So Mr. Acharya, Dr. Acharya earlier talked about how MSMEs may not necessarily have the reputation or assets to borrow loans today, because obviously, and that's the way the structure is. That's the way traditionally the structure has been. And obviously, we've had discussions around how all of that is changing, and is changing very, very quickly. And A lot of these digitization have actually accelerated in the last 2 years, especially because of COVID. So maybe I'll start with you, Mr. Venkat, for your closing remarks. I mean, if there's one thing you would like to change and one innovation to happen in supply chain finance, what would that be?
Yeah. No, it's already started. I'm just waiting for the day it is, visible to everybody. It's there in the formal manner. See, there's a saying that because of MNCs, the SMEs and small scale and MSMEs are disappearing. I have a completely different perspective and view. My belief is SMEs and MSME, like the example I earlier talked about in ERP with small apps making the ERP, these people coming together. The only thing which is missing today is which forum is bringing SMEs together. It's all today is informal forum. And that is where you will see the power of all these things are changing. Because even for a big corporate, for them to get delivery or a big banks to get delivery or the funders to get delivery, or even for us, Raj and Ravi's software to work, these people have to be onboarded and they have to do the transactions because they will be the legs and hands in this formal manner. So the transformation which I'm looking for through these technology partners, like Raj and Ravi is bringing it up. The small scale everybody will have, which they were scary earlier, both in terms of cost and infrastructure. There is a ready-made infrastructure available, so they can come together and they may also facilitate. I hope Raj and team, later Refinitiv will also create a collaborative partnership between all these people in a complementary basis. And that will become a formidable win-win situation for the whole community to both for supply chain finance as well as the entire commercial activity.
Thank you, Mr. Venkat. That was very, very lovely. Ravi, over to you for final comments. What is that one innovation you'd like to see in supply chain finance?
I think the factor that all of us will be surprised and pleasantly surprised with is this concept that things will have zero weight, right? So, we are of a generation where we would go wait in a queue at a bank, we would go wait in a queue at a store, we would go wait in a queue, right? We for everything, right? In a taxi, there would be a taxi, you would go wait in a queue. So I think this concept that if I have to get something, I should be ready to give up precious time is something that we'll see change very, very quickly, right? So, I have this concept that if you have zero patience is now equivalent to zero time. And then there was a difference. There was a difference that the fundamental social fabric allowed for the haves to measure time differently, right? So I would have a tatkal, which means I would get a premium. I would have a whole series of things that would place that non-weight premium, and then I would get a service, right? If I'm a big banker, then the banker would come home. If I was a big industrialist, the banker would come on to give money. Whereas if I was a small MSME, then I would have to wait at the doorstep of somebody. So I believe, if you ask me what is this, I believe in the concept that we are hopefully going to see this piece where there's a zero weight, which means that time finally gets equivalent to the cash and vice versa.
Thank you, Ravi. Thank you, Mr. Venkat. Thank you, Mr. Ravi. Thank you, Raj. It was a wonderful having all of you. I think we've got a lot of insights from all of you around how digitization is supporting supply chain finance and how things are changing rapidly across the globe, across Asia and even in India for that matter. So really looking forward to some of these innovations coming live. Thank you, everyone. Back to you.
Thank you, Sankara. This has been great. Thank you. Thanks, Raj. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sankara, for leading a wonderful panel discussion. I got to learn a lot from this entire discussion. So the fintech becoming vertical and getting layered, the loans getting listed was a very interesting concept which I heard. So I wish that happens soon. And I look forward to the open and digital trade finance ecosystem. I like my namesake Venkat's comment that hope the infrastructure will be available on a complementary basis, ready-made infrastructure. We all look forward to that. So on the whole, I personally thank all the panelists, Raj Melvani, Professional Sales Manager, Refinitiv, Ravindra Krishnappa, co-founder, Seabridge TFX, and my namesake, Venkat from Olam International Limited, for giving a very valuable inputs on the supply chain finance, digitization of supply chain finance, and Shankar Sambasivan for leading the panel to a very convincing conclusion. Thank you all.